Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my presentation. My name is Lorraine Li, and I did my summer internship at Toronto District School Board. And some of my work inspired me to doing this project, which is identifying tree planting priorities for the board. So here's a quick overview, and I will go over them one by one in a bit. So first, to give you a bit of background on my project, and as we all know that trees provide immense benefits to people and the environment, especially in the urban setting. And trees on school property play a unique role as the benefit mainly serves younger students and children. Therefore, tree benefits on school property are looked at from a little bit different angle in terms of shade provisioning, pollutant barrier, building energy effects, and academic performance. So TDSB, at the largest school board in Canada, has a relatively longer history in tree planting. The board has developed its sustainability initiatives and climate action since 2000, and the Eco School program launched in 2003 now is called Eco School Canada just last year, and the large tree program launched in 2007 has approximately planted more than 2,500 trees across the board and has set the goal to increase its planting capacity in response to Canada's 2 billion tree commitment. And TDSB is the only school board in Ontario that has done a complete tree inventory using the neighborhood planning program. So the TDSB has been looking for methodologies to ensure equity in tree planting, as trees on school property not only provide benefits to students, but also the neighboring community that has access to school's green spaces. And the board has developed this Learning Opportunity Index, LOI, to investigate the socio-economic factors for each school, as studies have shown that these factors have predominant influence over student achievement and performance. And concerns around equitable tree planting were brought up by board trustees, as schools in more disadvantaged communities were getting much fewer trees than those in wealthier or more resourceful neighborhood. And schools with lower LOI tend to have lower canopy coverage in general. And as of now, tree distribution at TDSB is at a first come, first served basis. Therefore, equity in tree planting needs to be addressed with more proactive approaches. So this brings to the question of how to ensure equitable tree distribution and how to identify tree planting priority for the board. And with that in mind, there are three objectives from a project. First, to identify tree planting priorities for all 583 TDSB schools based on set of spatial variables. And two, to compare geographical trend in TDSB's planting priority and heat vulnerability distribution of City of Toronto. And third, to provide guidelines and directions for future tree planting projects at TDSB. So the study area is all 583 schools and their properties. 4 variables were considered based on what I was able to obtain at the time. So the first is the Learning Opportunity Index, or LOI, as mentioned earlier. Then the percentage canopy coverage, and this was extracted from Toronto's forest and land cover data set. And the distance, and then the percent canopy coverage was calculated using GIS. And then distance to major arterial road, this was extracted from Toronto centralized data set, and the distance was also calculated in GIS. And the last one is canopy area per student for each school. So here's a map showing TDSB schools to give you an idea of the school distribution. So elementary schools are orange and purple ones are secondary, and the polygon represents the TDSB wards. So after data assembly, my professor Danijela helped me with data analysis in JMP, and 115 schools were actually excluded due to incomplete data. And then we log transform, and these scores standardized all variable values as they were skewed and abnormal. Then we ran principal component analysis to look at correlation between variables, and we decided to exclude canopy area per student as it was highly correlated with percent canopy cover. Then we used K-mean clustering analysis to segment school into groups based on similarity between variable values. And this generated 4 clusters of elementary school and 6 clusters of secondary school. And the number of cluster was determined by CCC value or cubic cluster criterion, which informs the optimal number of cluster that best fit the data. Then priority class high, medium, low were assigned to these clusters based on my interpretation of the data. And finally, planning priority was mapped in ArcGIS and was overlaid on top of Toronto's heat vulnerability distribution map. So here we have 2 tables on the left showing the initial result from clustering analysis, and 2 tables on the right showing the school planting priorities. So based on the average of LOI, percent canopy cover, and distance to major arterial road, I have combined clusters with relatively similar average. So for elementary school, I combined cluster 2 and 4 into high priority class, as they both have lower average in LOI and percent canopy coverage. And for secondary school, similar interpretation was applied, and then we have 2 clusters in each priority class. So now I mapped all 399 elementary schools in ArcGIS, and planting priority classes were color coded. So red is high, orange medium, and green is low. And we already see this geographical trend where high priority schools are mostly located in the northwest and northeast corner of the city. And the school with low planning priority are located mostly in the middle. Then we look at the purple polygons, which is the heat vulnerability index for each Toronto's neighborhood. And as expected, most high priority schools are in more heat vulnerable neighborhoods. So same mapping was done for secondary schools, and the geographical trend is not as obvious as the elementary school because there are only 69 schools in this map. But if you look at each dot closely, you will see that high priority schools are located mostly in the neighborhood that have higher heat vulnerability index. So let's put those dots into this bar chart, where the x-axis is planning priority class and y-axis is number of school, and then different colors showing the heat vulnerability index. And the table on the right is showing the percent schools in each priority class with different heat vulnerability index. And it is interesting to see that most elementary schools are either in high or low priority class. This could be due to more extreme data values pulling the average than those in the medium priority class. And we can see that 38% of elementary schools is in high priority class, and among that 10% or 40 schools are at immediate concern as they also have high heat vulnerability index. The similar chart for secondary school, where 6% or 4 schools are at immediate concern as they are in high planning priority class and have a high heat vulnerability index. So now we combine elementary and secondary into one graph. The axis now is showing the heat vulnerability index, and y-axis still number of schools. And the red bars are elementary and the orange ones are secondary. The table on the left is just describing the bar charts based on number of schools and gives you a more number-oriented interpretation. And from this table, we can see that 174 of all TDSB schools are at high priority, and 44 schools in this class needs immediate planting. Following that, we have 52 schools at second high concern, and this goes on with the decrease in heat vulnerability index. And after high priority class, we move on to the medium and we move on to the low so that we can use this to look at each planting priority class more closely. And for the time's sake, I will only show you the schools in the high priority class. So same thing as last chart, x-axis is the heat vulnerability index and y-axis is number of schools. And the table on the right is just detailing number of schools. So this would be the first group of school that TDSB focus its tree planting on, and from high to low heat vulnerability index. And same set of charts and tables can be produced for each priority class. So the TDSB can use this to inform its future planning strategies. So what we learned from the results, first, this project used a data-driven methodology to identify planting priority from high, medium to low. And we certainly see this correlation between identified priority class and heat vulnerability index, and the correlation is positive. And we were able to further segment school in each priority class using the heat vulnerability index. So within each class, we can tackle the most disadvantaged schools first so that equitable tree distribution can be achieved. And my recommendation to TDSB is, of course, to incorporate the identified tree planting priority classes from high to low in the planning process, and use heat vulnerability index for more detailed planning, and to update percent canopy cover and LOI periodically, and use the methodology to identify new planting priority once the first round of tree planting is complete for all schools. And in terms of tree planting at TDSB, certainly use the bar charts and the table producing this project to plan proactively, and use the data to adjust TDSB's planting capacity. And so if you want to plant at more schools, you have to increase your annual capacity and secure more trees from the nursery in advance. And depending on TDSB's planting goals, for example, say the board want to plant at all high priority elementary school within 2 years, then the planting capacity needs to be increased to 750 trees. Or if the planting capacity is set at the certain level, then the board can estimate how long it takes to achieve its goal using the data produced in this project. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge and thank my supervisor, Professor Danijela. I will not try to pronounce her last name. And then for her help and guidance throughout my capstone project. I'd like to thank my external examiner, Karen Dobrucki, and the entire sustainability office team for giving the opportunity to network and connect in the urban forest community. I'd like to thank my parents for their endless support and patience. And of course, thank you all my MFC colleagues for making this program memorable. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. Very interesting results. Karen Dobrucki, the external examiner, is on the line right now. Karen, would you like to go ahead and ask your questions?
Sure. Hi, thank you, Lorraine. That was that was wonderful. That was really well done. We too have really appreciated all that you and Daria did with us this summer, and we are using your information to develop our future next 3-year planting strategies. And that's something that I was just curious to know. And I know we've had lots of discussions over the last few months about that, or during your time with us. And just from your opinion, what do you think our strategy should be? Should we, using your information and, looking at how we are looking to increase our tree planting, would it be, in your opinion, is it better to kind of accomplish our goals of, is it better to focus and expand on our tree plantings at fewer schools but more trees, or is it better to take the approach of more schools but fewer trees, but be able to hit more of those heat vulnerable schools? What's your thought on that, if you have one? Did you think about that? Which is the better strategy for us?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it really depends, because as we see, like during my internship, some schools, they have very limited plantable spaces. So even if you want to plant like 20, 30 tree or like a grove or like a larger scale planting, you cannot do it. So you have to go to use Google Earth or go site visit and then decide how many trees you want to plant. But definitely use this planning priority results, because you do want to address that equity piece, which is quite important for the board right now, as the trustee already brought this up to the board. So that's something you have to address like as soon as possible. But I know, like for the large tree planting program led by you, I know you're under a lot of stress, as some schools will just ask for trees and you can't really say no. So maybe another thing you can do is you set, say, 100 trees for schools that come forward and ask you for trees, and you set another 200 to those schools in a more heat vulnerable area, or at higher planning priority.
I think, well, that's interesting that you said that, because that's kind of what we're doing when we are looking to expand our numbers. We are dedicating some of our tree planting to the responsive tree requests, and then a bigger portion to a planned, like a planned approach, which is what you've provided some information with this trees. Will we have access to this by chance, by your
Yes,
data?
yes. I think at the end you will get my presentation and my paper after I complete them.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Lorraine. That was awesome. Very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, Lorraine. I was really keen to see the results here, having worked with these data before. I wonder, just stepping back, what are you trying exactly to optimize, right? If you've got you're planning planting campaign, and I think that's not been really carefully spelled out. You've got learning opportunity index as one criteria and heat vulnerability index as one criteria. And you mentioned, right, there's certain schools that have limited areas. And it's also obvious looking at schools, there's some schools that'll have places where trees would make a big difference, but they're not necessarily trees there. And there's also educational benefits of trees. The visibility of trees may make a big difference. And it occurs to me that putting things in clusters, the kind of approach you've used, is then you end up with a set of schools that might be higher or lower priority. And what TDSB could really use is kind of a numerical value. This is the highest priority school, and so putting things into groups may have some real limitations, in terms of rolling out an effective, more equitable tree planting strategy.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, you're saying I should rank them for from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This, yeah. So the reason I didn't do that is like I said earlier, that you have to do site visit to decide that. This is more like a tool to facilitate the planning process, so where to look first. And the reason I use LOIs because tree benefits on school property, they're more for students than the general public. So instead, we want to bring this, if we're using this methodology, then we want to convince the board to adopt this. So then we have to motivate them. So how do we motivate them that we're using the students? Sorry, but we're using them as our motivation. So saying we're trying to improve student performance and achievement through tree planting. So that's why I used LOI. And then another thing with heat vulnerability index is that the number is one index per neighborhood. So some school may have same index, and it's not really a number. It's not different for each school. So it was a little bit difficult to put all variable values into comparison. So heat vulnerability index is something kind of additional to validate my results, basically. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Would the first thing you want to know about a school be, are there spaces to plant trees? Right?
Yeah, that's one limitation of this project.
It can't be a high priority school.
Yes, you're right. You're right, because we want to use plantable space or softscape versus hardscape at first place, but then we just don't have the data, as they're just digitizing everything in GIS this year. So we don't have the data for their softscape versus hardscape or plantable space.
Well, we have all that data that exists. Yeah.
Okay. Let me know. I mean, I can definitely improve on this. If yeah. Okay, good to know.
Thanks, Lorraine. I just want to go back to remind you that you use variables and improved on the approach that TDSB was using this summer for selecting priority schools. Remember the ranking scale that we looked, and that that was something that kind of carried a bias quite a bit, that was hard to pinpoint, like why certain schools should get priority. So my question is, you guys did 3 inventory this summer, right? And you did record plantable space?
No, we didn't.
Okay, the old inventory did record plantable space, which was assessed on the ground, and it was based on canopy size. So do you think that with this information, where you have priority schools and you have either available growing space or you have neighborhoods planting space, you would be able to produce a yearly plan, how many trees could be planted and what size classes and at what schools?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for the same method, we can always add more variables to achieve the result else we want. And just if we're trying to increase canopy coverage, then definitely we should include other variables like plantable spaces and canopy area. And yeah.
The other question that I had, again, I'm going back to what you had and what you did over the summer. Your variables were the same as you used during your internship. Or no?
I'm trying. Yeah, we like during the summer we also consider the variable of case count of COVID in each neighborhood, because at the time, this makes sense because the COVID was quite severe at the time. But then we excluded that as this also correlate with the heat vulnerability index. So we're looking at maps that showing the similar distribution. So neighborhoods that have higher heat vulnerability index also have higher case count. So then we decide to exclude the COVID. This is one-time pandemic, so maybe heat vulnerability index is more useful.
Yeah, and we discussed about distance to the roads. Why did you take the main roads only, not the?
Oh, this includes highway. So it's highway and major arterial road.
What was the reason? Remind me, pollution or noise?
Yeah, because there's studies saying that major arterial road and then school within the 500 buffer zone, they are vulnerable and exposed to the traffic-induced air pollutants. That's why we use distance to our major arterial road.
Thank you.
Great. We have time for one last quick question, if there is one. No, if not, thank you very much, Lorraine. We'll move on to our next speaker.